When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy channel. Today's video, we are going to be talking about the supposed news that the dragon eggs that we saw in episode 3 were actually the eggs that are going to be Daenerys's by the beginning of the main story with the Game of Thrones that end up hatching. I want to talk about why I really don't feel like that makes any sense in terms of the actual book lore, and kind of talking about the differences between the show lore and the book lore. I feel like there's been some misconceptions that those two things are the same thing. They are not. So I want to talk about that a little bit in today's video and give you guys the alternative, if you're not familiar with Fire and Blood, what the most common theory is for where Daenerys' eggs come from, and the one I truly believe in. But before we get into the video, if you did want to become a Patreon or a member, check that out. You do get videos early, and you do get exclusive House of the Dragon videos, one each week. And so, yeah, thank you for everybody that supports me on there, and let's get into the video. So, I want to start by going with what the proposed version of how most book readers think Daenerys got her eggs. So, it all starts with this character of Alyssa Farman. This is a character that is known for trying to go west of Westeros. She basically has like the Arya plot at the end of Game of Thrones, where she wants to figure out what's going on there. And we have some loose accounts, but we don't know exactly what happened to Alyssa Farman when she went west of Westeros. Did she just eventually die? Did she discover even more land? She discovered some land, but she kept going. So yeah, that's kind of the ending we know for Alyssa Farman. But the important part about Alyssa Farman, she was a very close companion of Rhaena Targaryen. Now, not the Rhaena of the House of the Dragon, the Rhaena who was the sister of Jaehaerys, who becomes king, or the wife of Aegon, who actually was killed by Maegor. Rhaena was a very interesting character. She's one of my favorite characters. She's my favorite character during the Jaehaerys time period of the story in Fire and Blood. And Alyssa Farman was someone that was always seen as wanting to have her own ship and figure out, what's west of Westeros. She was very similar to Arya in that regard. And so Alyssa Farman and Rhaena kind of have a bit of a breakup. There seems like there was some sort of relationship there. Rhaena Targaryen seems to be maybe bisexual, or maybe she was a lesbian. We're not sure completely in the story. It's not made completely clear. But it seems like Alyssa Farman and Rhaena Targaryen had somewhat of a romantic relationship. So when that's all kind of falls out, Alyssa Farman asks to leave Rhaena Targaryen, permitting her to leave. And so in 54 AC, that is allowed to happen. Rhaena is not very happy about it, but it does happen. So at this time, Alyssa Farman then steals, discreetly, 3 dragon eggs. There's a whole plot that is revolved around this exact moment during Jaehaerys' reign. I think, to me, it's one of my favorite parts of Jaehaerys' reign, as there's 3 dragon eggs that are stolen. And so Alyssa Farman goes to Pentos, she goes to Bravos, she goes to all these different places in the Free Cities, because she's kind of an exile, right? If somebody was to find her with a dragon egg, she'd probably be killed. So she ends up going to Bravos, and she sells her eggs to the Sea Lord, or of Bravos. That's the proposed story, more or less. It seems like that is the case based upon Jaehaerys negotiating with Bravos, because, again, he doesn't want anyone to have these eggs. And the Sea Lord of Bravos kind of does one of these where he denies having them and all of that, but it seems likely he did have them. And so the proposed idea is eventually that Illyrio, with his influence that he had in Pentos, would have eventually gotten those eggs, which makes sense as to why then those eggs would have been given to Daenerys. Again, there's no other way in the story in Fire and Blood that we know of where dragon eggs were kind of put in Essos. There is no other situation where we're distinctively told that eggs could have landed there. And also, George tells us it's 3 dragon eggs. That's not a coincidence. So it kind of seems like the show has now kind of changed that canon. So let's now flip to the show. What did the show do? The show decided to take these 3 eggs, or I guess she has 4, but 3 of them are going to be Daenerys' dragons that she's going to send with this Rhaena. A different Rhaena. I know it's confusing, but the Rhaena of House of the Dragon. So, okay, let's think about this for a second, right? Because how are these 3 eggs going to get to Essos? And it makes sense based upon a plot line going forward, so there will be a kind of a spoiler here, even though we're not sure exactly what's going to happen. What ends up happening in the normal story of Fire and Blood is that Aegon and Viserys, the 2 children of Rhaenyra, her youngest, we see them briefly in episode 3, they actually eventually are going to be sent over to Essos, to Pentos, for safekeeping. And so at that point, they actually get intercepted by the Triarchy, and Viserys is presumed dead, but he's actually taken captive, and Aegon flees. This could be the way that the eggs are said to then get to somehow being in Essos and for Illyrio. But at the same time, I don't think it works necessarily with the book canon of events. Something like Rhaenyra publicly giving Rhaena the eggs, and again, there was multitudes of people that saw this take place in the show. It doesn't make any sense then how those eggs are then just not heard of in Fire and Blood, right? So that's my big moment where I try to... This is my big thing, right? Where I think that House of the Dragon has their own canon that connects with maybe Game of Thrones, which is good, right? But it doesn't connect with the book canon events. And again, technically, Alyssa Farman's stuff is not canon, right? That's not a confirmed thing. It's more or less the community's suspicion. It's one of those theories that it's not confirmed, but it's one of those where it's like 99.9% correct, right? Where George has yet to say it's correct, but it feels like it's correct. And so I come back to this point of the book canon versus the show canon. They are not the same things, right? In terms of the book canon, Alicent is much older than she is in House of the Dragon, right? House of the Dragon did this big change where they made Alicent of an age with Rhaenyra, which I think was a really interesting change and actually allowed the two characters to have more dynamics and have more of a relationship, which I thought was a good idea. But at the same time, it's different than what Fire and Blood and the canon of the story is, right? You can't say that the Maesters got Alicent's age significantly wrong. There's a quite clear-cut difference between the book and the show. George R. R. Martin has multiple times confirmed this himself, right? In terms of, if you look at Viserys, right? George's version of Viserys was a much, worse character in terms of how we looked at him in the books, right? Before House of the Dragon came out, Viserys was viewed, and still is viewed, I think, by the community as one of the worst kings for the Targaryens ever, right? He was like a better version of Aegon IV, right? Where Aegon IV was just a big step over from Viserys, where he was even more, lusty or liking his food and delicacies and women and all these things. Viserys was maybe a more tamer version of Aegon IV, but he still made horrible decisions and was a terrible king and led to the downfall, really, of the dragons. So Viserys is a character that in the book Fire and Blood is a worse version than the Viserys of the show. And again, I think a lot of those changes were good in season 1. I think what they did with Viserys was great. I think Alicent and Rhaenyra being of an age is great, but I'm trying to have the distinct point right here that it is a clear difference from book canon to show canon. And people may argue with me in the comments and say, oh, well, Fire and Blood is not actually canon for anything because it's written through Maesters and all these things, but to an extent, I agree. It's why I like Fire and Blood. But to another extent, I don't disagree. Or I don't agree because certain things like dates, ages, public events, things like that are canon. You're going to have multiple sources that are going to be saying that that same thing happened, right? So in those regards, things are canon. But when you have other things where, like, say, Rhaenyra and Daemon's relationship early on, that's not confirmed in the book. So yeah, you can say, oh, maybe House of the Dragon, that version of events is what you believe is canon, right? I personally, myself, have always viewed House of the Dragon as one of the many possibilities of what could have actually happened, right? I always go back to Rhaenyra and Criston Cole. In my canon of events, Rhaenyra is the one that spurns Criston Cole. Kind of like in the show, not exactly the same, right? Because the show has it where Rhaenyra kind of gets ditched by Daemon, and then she goes then to Criston Cole, and then that's when they have sex. I never viewed it as that. I thought it was more like Criston Cole was kind of coming on to her, but she also liked him as well. But then she didn't want to have any kind of relationship with him, right? So that's kind of the way I view those events. Other people might view it as Criston Cole spurned Rhaenyra, right? That he was the honorable person. We just don't know in the book, but you have to base it on actions that come after, right? The way Criston Cole kind of acts like a child, right? After this engagement, or after this moment he has with Rhaenyra, right? So I think that's all interesting to study, right? But the main point of this idea to show to you guys, I've tried to, provide examples and all these things, is that regardless of what the show does with Dany's eggs, because they made it quite clear they're trying to tie the show to Game of Thrones, it doesn't matter if you are talking about the book. If you're talking about the book canon, the book canon is separate from the show canon. Things that happen in the show did not necessarily happen in the book. It's the same way with Game of Thrones, the television show. There's certain things that happened in the show that probably won't happen in the book, right? And I'm not even talking early parts of the season, right? There are conversations like Robert and Cersei having that conversation that don't happen in the book. So it's not exactly book canon that that conversation happened, but it's something that we can believe probably did take place, or it's a conversation we could have seen happening. So that's the big point of it, is right? Is the book canon, is the book canon, the show canon, is the show canon. Let's not mix them up and say one is the definitive correct answer, because that's just not the case. But thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Also, let me know what you guys think about this change with the idea of Alyssa Farman was not the way Daenerys got her dragons.